Thank you for joining us today. My name is not Ayala. It is Esther Schlesinger. I'm with the Canadian Friends of the Hebrew U. Unfortunately, Ayala could not moderate today, so I'm taking over. So I would like to welcome everybody to the third session of our Centennial Author Spotlight Series in honor of the 100th anniversary of the Hebrew University. I want to thank our book club committee, Joanna Goldman, Panina Konchevsky, and Cynthia Knight for helping us choose books and helping us overall with this project. It's our absolute delight to welcome author Janice Wiezman today, joining us from Israel to talk about her latest book, Our Little Histories. Janice's debut novel, The Wayward Moon, won the Independent Publishers Award, and Our Little Histories was a finalist for the Sami Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature in Writing. Her writing has appeared in the Los Angeles Review, Haaretz, Queen's Quarterly, the Times of Israel, and many other distinguished publications. She is currently pursuing a PhD at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in the works of Alice Munro. We'd also like to welcome Michael Posner today as our moderator. He's an award-winning writer, playwright, and journalist. Michael is the author of 9 acclaimed books, including the best-selling bio Mordechai Richler, The Last Honest Man, All of Me, The Anne Murray Story, and the first 3 volumes of Leonard Cohen's Untold Stories. He also served as a managing editor for the Financial Times of Canada and spent 16 years as a senior writer with the Globe and Mail. Please join me in welcoming Janice and Michael to our session today. And Michael, over to you. Take it away.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. And let me just say what a delight it is for me to be here and have this opportunity to interview Janice, who is my niece, of course. And I think we should declare that up front and talk about her wonderful novel, Our Little Histories. This is the most obvious question, but it's the most inevitable question as well, which is how did this idea originally occur to you? What inspired you to take a single family and stitch together the various threads and skeins of their history into one seamless whole? What was the genesis of that idea?
Thanks. Before I reply, I just want to thank Esther and for Hebrew University for hosting me and including me in this amazing author series. So thank you. So in terms of how I started thinking about this book, my first novel, The Wayward Moon, takes place in the 9th century in the Middle East. And I wrote it. I was very excited about it. It was very much inspired by living in Israel for all these years. But then when I was done with all that, I started to wonder why I hadn't turned to my own roots, why I went so far from, the place I came from and the people I came from. And the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to me that there was something about it that I didn't feel quite comfortable with. And there was something else that sort of really struck me. When I thought about my roots, which are obviously in Eastern Europe, it seemed very, very far from me. But when I thought about, how far, well, it was only about 4 generations, say 100 years. And I felt that there was such a disconnect between, me and my generation and the people I grew up with and the communities that we came out of. And I wondered why was that so? So I think that the answer was sort of complicated. I think anyone who knows anything about, immigration and the behavior of immigrants when they're trying to adjust to a new country and fit in, I think that part of it is rooted in that, this sort of desire to sort of put a wall between the things that they left and maybe ran from and the life that they want to begin. So yeah, and also there's a few other points. I mean, there's the notion of language, right? I don't speak Yiddish, It never bothered me. It wasn't a problem. But at some point, I started to think, well, actually, like my great grandparents were Yiddish speakers. That was their mother tongue. So how come I can't speak it? I can't understand it. And so I thought that that was also kind of strange. And I wanted to explore that, like what happened to the language that all these people spoke. But most of all, it was this sense that I, started to realize that all of us, all of the, say, Jewish community in Toronto that I came from, and many other communities in North America, well, their roots were in these tiny shtetls in the middle of nowhere, in places that were, both remote and very hostile to them. So that they came from places where life was very, very difficult, and they were usually impoverished and traumatized. And yet, their descendants, who would be, the communities that immigrated to the West, and those people who, moved to what would become the state of Israel, were unbelievably successful in developing new societies, their achievements, their, the places that they arrived in the new societies and what they achieved. So just looking at all of that, it was sort of like, what is that trajectory over just 100 years from these, people who look more or less like the people in Fiddler on the Roof to, Nobel Prize winners and presidents and movie stars and economic powerhouses and the like.
And all the rest. Fascinating. Now, one somewhat unconventional aspect of the novel is its back to front structure. That is to say, it begins in the present, or roughly the present, contemporary life of a Jewish family out of Chicago, and takes us back episodically in time, 150 odd years, 160 years or so, to Belarus, and a little shtetl in Belarus, known then as Propoisk and known today as Slavgorod, something like that. What was the inspiration for telling this story in a sense backward? What was going through your mind? When did that idea occur to you? Was that there from the beginning?
Yeah, I was really thinking about reader experience, where we begin with this story with people who are more or less like us, living in a very recognizable social environment. And slowly, slowly, it sort of moves back in time, getting further and further away from the people we are, until in the last chapter, you sort of land in this little town in the middle of Belarus, where people just, they're living traditional Jewish lives and they are not really exposed to the wider world. And I wanted the reader to sort of be able to experience that sort of time travel. Literature is a wonderful way to be able to put yourself and envision yourself in other eras, to sort of help you to think, well, what if I was born then? Or what brought us to the place we are now, but what did it actually feel like emotionally? So I definitely wanted that experience. And then afterwards, it sort of struck me that also what I was doing was sort of like constructing something like a tree, where you have, you know, um, obviously the tree and the leaves and the branches, but it's all being fed by a system of roots underground that you can't see. So the roots are invisible, but there was actually feeding into the tree. And I think that the structure kind of shows that in a way as well.
Absolutely. Now, your title, Our Little Histories, it struck me that I wouldn't say tongue in cheek is probably the wrong phrase to use, but there's an element of it in that, these are indeed little histories. They're all discrete stories that are linked by genealogy and family history. But in a sense, you're really telling the story of the Jewish people over the last 150 years. This is a continuous tapestry, a continuous narrative. And these little histories in their aggregate are the story of the Jewish people over the last 150 years. So they're not so little after all. What say you to that?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the concept, sort of the intersection of a larger history with personal histories. and how, you know, the environment and the place and time that you're born into is going to be shaping the person you are and the decisions you make and the path you take. That was basically the idea that small things are not small at all. I mean, that's basically, I think that the book shows that in each story, I'm sort of honing in on a certain person and in a certain situation. Each one extremely different than the rest, because each story is set in a very different place, right? You're moving from, say, Chicago to Belarus to Tel Aviv in the 60s to, you know, Chicago in the 30s and Vilna in Eastern Europe in the 1930s, and then all the way back to, as I said, a time of shtetls. And in each one, you don't need to be thinking of, you know, the grand sweep of history, because it's enough that you get into these small narratives, and it just sort of comes together for you in terms of understanding the larger picture. It's kind of an interesting back and forth.
It strikes me that each of these chapters, because they're discrete periods of time, must have required an enormous amount of reading and research just for you to familiarize yourself with the thinking, the mores, the customs, the habits, the idiosyncrasies of life in those periods. I read elsewhere, I think that it took you 10 years to do the novel. Now, I know you have other things in your life, that, including a family and a business and teaching and writing, but I can see why it would have taken 10 years, because the amount of research that you've done here must have been extraordinary. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, well, absolutely. The way I researched it was by looking at works of fiction from each period. In addition to, of course, you know, internet and Google Maps and, you know, all kinds of other sources. But fiction was really key because it helped me to get into minds of people at the time. So I would look at writers who were writing at the time of the story. And I do give a list of sources in the back. So, for example, in the 1930s, you have like Mayor Levin's Our Crowd, where, you know, he's talking about this group of teenagers in Chicago. And when he was writing it, I mean, he didn't know what was going to happen. He couldn't see the future. He was writing it very much of that moment. So it was extremely helpful, just even in terms of the way people talked and what was interesting to them, what they noticed, how they behaved. You know, these are the things that you can get. And it was especially helpful with the more earlier sections in Eastern Europe, which obviously, like, I have no real connection to in terms of firsthand sources, but in terms of like writers, Yiddish writers, you know, the more famous ones like Shalom Aleichem and Peretz and Singer, and also less famous ones, mostly women who wrote, you know, also out of their own time and place in their own lives. And that really, really helped me because in each story, I really wanted to give a perspective from people who lived then. I didn't want to be sort of writing in sort of a third person, you know, from my point of view and what I think their lives would have been like. I have to sort of try and be in their heads and knowing what they know, seeing what they see, but no more than that. So that was the challenge.
There does seem to be a kind of preponderance or a stress, I guess, on the female point of view, which I suspect is not an accident. You alluded to reading Yiddish writers, women writing in Yiddish, who are not really terribly well known, broadly speaking. Was that an objective here, to highlight the extent to which women really were the custodians of Jewish continuity, in a way, that they had enormous agency in these lives, even if they aren't familiarly recognized as having had that role, that they played an enormous role in Jewish continuity that hasn't really been recognized. Am I right in thinking that way?
Well, that's a great question, but the truth is that it wasn't one of my main objectives to show how women were important. And I think I was writing out of this idea that the women just were, you know, full participants in the time and the place that they were living, in the communities they were living. So some of the stories actually are centered on a male protagonist. It's not only women. But I think that having said that, it was sort of interesting for me to take these stories and tell them a bit from a female perspective. I mean, that does sound like like a paradox, but it wasn't the main thing I was thinking of. I was thinking about in each chapter, sort of taking a situation or, a given set of circumstances that need to be dealt with, and then thinking about a protagonist who is going to be acting in that situation. And obviously I would, I wasn't going to write only male protagonists in each story. So, but I'm really happy that that emerges because I think it does give a truer picture of what life was really like for, for families, for communities, for people. The women were there, obviously. They're just not usually memorialized in literature.
Correct. There's a kind of symbolic or totemic narrative spine that connects these stories in the form of I don't want to give too much away here in terms of the plot to those who haven't read the book, but there is a narrative spine that links generation to generation in the form of a Yiddish poem. I wonder to what extent can you talk about that?
Well, I think I was interested in literature in general and the role that literature, played in the movement of Jews out of a religious sort of ghetto life and into the wider world. And the truth is that Yiddish literature also, it didn't, I mean, I guess probably began 250 years ago, more or less, in terms of, fiction and poetry that wasn't related to the Bible or the Talmud. So it was kind of young and it didn't have a lot of chance to develop, but and then of course tragically it was obliterated completely. It was quite a sensation while it was while it was part of people's lives and language. Um, and I wanted to sort of I like the idea, in addition to that, I like the idea of having a piece of literature that moves from generation to generation in various ways, and people don't always quite understand what it is or what it means or why it was written, and the connection is lost, but it does show up in each story. And I think that there's a sort of a message of connection here, of something cultural that is passed from generation to generation in some way. And what's sort of tragic is by the time you get to the later generations, they really don't know about who wrote it or why they wrote it. It's a complete mystery to them. And I guess that sort of symbolizes how the connection many of us have to the families that we came out of. I mean, we know what we know, but beyond that, it's really a bit of a mystery. So it
Now,
mirrors
the
that.
the opening chapter, in the opening chapter, we have a contemporary Jewish woman who is entirely secular, not religious, has intermarried, doesn't speak Hebrew, but is a museum curator who is hired to create a kind of living diorama or a living presentation of old shtetl life in Belarus, at the request of I don't know, let's call him a Belarusian millionaire, a Russian millionaire.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because what you're basically you've turned shtetl life into a kind of museum culture. I'm reminded of the story. I think it's true that Hitler, may his name be disgraced and abominated for eternity, um, had the intention or planned one or more museums of an extinct Jewish culture, the Jewish culture, of course, in Prague and other places. And here we are recreating literally this museum culture for modern day Belarusians. And I'm wondering, 100 years from now, will Jewish communities look back on the suburbs of upstate New York and Long Island and Toronto and Los Angeles and Chicago and recreate the quaint suburban Jewish life of assimilated Jews in the West?
Wow. I mean, that sounds like a really good series, actually. Screenwriters take note. In that story, though, I really did sort of want to connect it to our own time. And it's a time where the whole idea of time is completely sort of upended, in the sense that, with internet now and with being able to visit all kinds of places and know all kinds of things, and the things have lost their mystique in a way. And so the idea of recreating a scene from the past, I mean, it's just, you always have this complicated thing of it's both authentic and not authentic. It's both real and not real. And in the story, the protagonist kind of gets lost in that. And she comes to a point where she doesn't really know what's the installation with the family enacting Judaism, and what is real, what is an actual family being Jewish. So I wanted to sort of enact that because I think that's kind of the times that we're living in. And everything is kind of postmodern and not it's both, it's one thing and another. It's never just itself.
Right, that's a good point. Now, I read the book, of course, I think in the fall of 2023 when it came out, just after the war had started or around the time the war had started. And it's interesting to, and in going through it again in preparation for this chat today, it occurred to me to think about the extent to which the war had, if you were writing it today, what impact would that have on you? Because for many Jews, I think, certainly in Israel and indeed in the diaspora, the war marks a kind of watershed moment in modern Jewish history, and has had an enormous impact on their thinking, either wherever they may sit on the political spectrum. And so for many Jews, as you probably know, it's raised the issue of their Jewish identity. It's for some, it's brought them back to question their identity. It's brought them back to Judaism in many ways, and for others not so much. But it's a pivotal moment, and I'm wondering, if you were writing that book today, what would be going through your mind in terms of trying to embrace the questions that the war gives rise to?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that. I think many Jewish authors are,
No doubt, no
grappling
doubt.
with, the before and the after. But I think that if I was gonna add another chapter, even if I was writing it after, October 7th, I couldn't leave it as I ended it then. And I think what is developed, what has emerged since October 7th is this notion that the community in North America, or Jewish communities around the world, and the Jews in Israel are, as you see in the book, very closely related. They came out of the same communities, whether those communities are Ashkenazi or Mizrahi, they came out of the same communities and they're the same people. And I think that before October 7th, I mean, I think there was a lot of feelings of alienation from people's, backgrounds and histories and Jewish identity. And that sort of was completely overturned for many, many people. It's a very, it's an interesting thing to happen all of a sudden, big groups of people all of a sudden realizing that they don't quite belong to the people they thought they belonged to, but they do belong to people they didn't really think they belonged to. So I think that there's sort of a new sort of coming together, or rethinking the connection between the Jews in Israel and the Jews abroad. And it's complicated. And I think it's become very complicated, in recent years. But what has become clear is that in terms of identity, there's something very strong that is shared, despite the big geographical differences and cultural differences. So I
Yeah,
think
I
we have to
mean,
make room for that.
you do hear people in the West and in Jewish communities here in Toronto, and I'm sure in New York and Chicago and Los Angeles and elsewhere, sometimes make the comparison that we're not living in 1933 Germany after Hitler was elected, but we might well be living in 1929 or 1930 or 31 Germany, where anti-Semitism is rampant and the warning signs are written on the wall, and Jewish communities are clearly concerned, if not frightened. In your book, in one of the chapters, one of the Israeli characters, a descendant of the original family, has arrived in Israel, and she writes to her relatives who are still living in Poland or Belarus or Russia. uh, you folks might want to think about getting out of there. Things don't look too good. And and I have a hunch that those kind of letters are being written today, from Israel, um, to relatives in Western Europe, particularly, but not just Western Europe, also to places in North America and Australia and New Zealand, saying, read the writing on the wall, folks. This is how it started in Germany. You might want to give some thought to getting out. What are your thoughts on that issue?
Um, Listen, I think that the big difference between then and now is that the Jews do have a country. They do. There is a place that will take them, and that's gigantic. And I
Yep.
think that gives a sense of confidence to people, so that you know they feel like there's always that alternative if things get too difficult. Um, I mean, it's really hard to predict where it's all going, obviously.
Well, indeed, it was hard for all the characters in your book to
Yeah, yeah.
anticipate the direction of things.
Yeah.
Absolutely, but I do think that those sort of letters are probably, those discussions are being held in families today. Should we be thinking about leaving? Um,
Mm.
at the same time, you can make the argument, and I'm interested in your thoughts on this, that in fact, even with the level of anti-Semitism that we're seeing today on our streets, on our college campuses, historic as it is for our lives, is really nothing, compared to the kind of anti-Semitism that Jews in the shtetl experienced, that Jews in Germany and France and other European countries experienced for hundreds of years, in terms of exclusion and discrimination and ostracism and expulsion, and levels of poverty. We were nowhere near that kind of level, and yet clearly we are very alarmed at what we're seeing, and there is a lot of concern. Um, but I sense in your book that, I don't know if this is deliberate, and this is where I'm headed with the question, that you don't want to be too pessimistic about the Jewish future. One chapter ends with the word consolation. Another ends with the word comfort. A third ends with the sun breaking through at dawn. And in the final
Mm.
chapter, after the historic decision that the central character of that chapter is forced to make, despite all the pain and grief that accompanies that decision, she ends with laughter in her heart. Um, and so I wondered if that reflects Janice Wiezman's view, a kind of optimism that we will, despite everything, um, survive, persist, and even thrive.
Well, I think if you look at the whole length of Jewish history, and as you say, there's been, so many difficulties and challenges, and every era seems to have a new take on ways to be anti-Semitic and contexts in which to be anti-Semitic. But what stands out is the resilience of Jewish people and the survival. And it's true that I think our ancestors went through sometimes much more difficult times than we have. And I guess I'm optimistic. I mean, I think Judaism has proven itself as an idea that can survive almost anything, maybe everything. And what's interesting is, I don't know, I mean, here in Israel, I even meet people sometimes who have converted to Judaism. Like, it continues to even be an attractive option to some people who weren't born into it. And when you're, maybe it looks different from here, but when you're here and you go out, whatever, in the morning, at night, and you see people just living their lives and, you know, making plans and being together and doing things that they like, and then it doesn't feel like Judaism is coming to some sort of end, or the Jewish people are coming to some sort of end. It sort of feels like the opposite. So, I mean, I think there's every reason to be optimistic in the long run. In the short run, there could be a lot of difficulties. I think that, this era that we're in has a few very new aspects to it that didn't exist in the past.
Such
Like,
as?
well, first of all, the internet, right? So it's true that it's, wonderful for propaganda and lies, but for those who are interested, it's also wonderful for spreading the truth or spreading, other messages. And also the fact that, you do have this sort of structure of democracies and the Western liberal tradition, which is not that amenable to, racism and anti-Semitism. I mean, obviously there's room for that too, but at its source, I mean, if you look at, say, like the Inquisition, I mean, the church was all about, Jews shouldn't exist, and
So why don't we
look
carry
at the Crusades, and that was the same thing. And then another aspect I think is a real threat is Muslim, extremism. And that's a gigantic threat to the West in general, not just to Jews. And I think more and more people are waking up to that. So all of those factors are things that didn't exist in the past, and it will be just really interesting to see how they all play out together. Because like I said, there's a lot that's new here.
Indeed, there is. So now that's 2 novels under your belt. What is in the offing for Janice Wiezman? What's in the word processor as we speak?
Well, as Esther mentioned, I'm working on a PhD at Hebrew University.
Yes, about a Canadian author.
That's right, Alice Munro, and yeah, it's
Oliver
keeping me
Sholem.
busy. Yeah, I'm enjoying it a lot. It's very, very interesting. It's completely different, obviously, than the subject of Our Little Histories. And I have a few other novels in the works as well.
That you're
And,
obviously not willing to talk about.
well, I mean, I can just in 2 words. One of them is sort of focusing on, it's actually a novel set in Toronto, and it's dealing with the subject of segregated seating in the synagogue. And it also ties in a little bit to the work of Henry Morgentaler, which I suppose the Canadians out there are familiar with. And then I'm working on something else, which is sort of structured like Michael Cunningham's The Hours, with this sort of idea of a reader, a writer, and a character sort of coming together in an interesting way.
Fascinating, fascinating. You mentioned earlier, you cited, of course, the extraordinary success that Jews have had in basically since they were freed in Europe during the Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment period, when they were able to participate more actively in broader society. And so for 200 plus years, we have witnessed a period of Jewish exceptionality, I suppose, where we bat way above our presumed weight in terms of our achievements in almost every walk of life. That isn't so much a feature of the characters in your book, but it's certainly a feature of modern Jewish life. And I just wondering if you had any thoughts on that numerically we are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, and yet you could choose any professional field, the arts, culture, medicine, science, philanthropy, and Jews are right at the top of the heap in a disproportionate way statistically to their numbers in the population. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on that? I know it's off the beaten track in terms of your book, but I'm curious to know your thinking on that.
Well, listen, I mean, that's sort of a question for geneticists and social scientists.
Aren't you that?
Um, I mean, a phenomenon is a phenomenon, and the numbers don't lie. Yeah, listen, I mean, I think it's a phenomenon that's been noticed, in many sectors, not just by Jews. I mean, I think what will be interesting to see if that continues. There are some trends, especially in Israel, that are very worrying in terms of that. I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
Well, I'd be curious. What do you mean? What are the worrying trends?
I think that in terms of, well, just, moving into the idea of modern Israel and the government we have here, a lot of the spending is being turned to what they like to call Jewish identity, like a very specific version of Jewish identity. And then they're getting a lot of money for this and programs. Whereas, the actual mainstream education that isn't religious is a lot less popular with this government. They're very concerned about, how schools are reacting to Judaism, and they're less, I mean, I don't want to say that they've abandoned, STEM fields or the importance of education. That's not true, but I think they could be doing much, much more. And they're not, because politically, that's not where they're interested. So I think the next generation, I mean, in Israel, unfortunately, there's always going to be stars. There's always going to be, geniuses. But for the average, I don't know, it's concerning. It's concerning a lot of, professionals who work in the field.
Well, there seems to be two phenomena going on. One is there are Jews leaving the West for Israel, not
Mhm.
always for religious reasons, but as I alluded to earlier, for safety reasons, for concern about their future safety in the West. And then
Mhm.
there's the counter phenomenon of Israelis in significant numbers in the last couple of years leaving Israel for the West
Mhm.
and kind of turning their backs on Israel. Are you familiar with that, the latter phenomenon?
Of course, of course. Well, and listen, there's a lot of concern here that I mean, really, you don't want to get me started. But first of all, there's very big problems of corruption in this government. Very, very corrupted individuals, desire to, take away all the power of the courts so that the government and the ministers can do whatever they want. Um, and problems with funding for universities to some extent. So all of these things make it less desirable for people who want the country to thrive and succeed. It's a very difficult environment to be working in and living in. I think abroad you don't see that side so much, but it definitely
No, I don't think you do. Not nearly as much. I want to open this up to some questions, of course, but let me just pose one other question to you before we do that. I'm just wondering how you feel, whether you're optimistic about the future of literature itself, not just necessarily Jewish literature, but just literature itself in an age in which an overwhelming majority of the people now consume what passes for literacy in 45-second TikTok videos and Instagram videos. And although books are bought, they are less and less read. And books are published but not read. And there are concerns, broadly speaking, about the future of literacy itself, or the attention span that has withered on the vine, as I'm sure you're aware. And so, you wonder whether we haven't, much as Jews in America now say we are at the end of a golden age that is coming to an end with the rise of anti-Semitism. I'm wondering whether we are also at the end of golden age of literacy that is coming to an end. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, I'm aware of all this.
No doubt.
I always think of something Philip Roth famously said years ago, which is something like literature is going to go the way of like Latin poetry, where you'll have a very small group of people who read it, and that's it. Yeah, unfortunately, that might be true, what you're saying about literature. I mean, it's a medium, and it's a very demanding medium. It's demanding in time, it's demanding in attention, and it's demanding in mental work. And, most people aren't interested in those things. There are so many other ways to spend your time and your energy. So I'm not that optimistic. I mean, I think it'll continue to exist. And obviously, there's always going to be people who are interested in reading and reading difficult works even. But in general, the time where, I don't know, many writers that I know look back to the time of Saul Bellow and Philip Roth when, they'd publish a book and, it was headlines and interviews and tons of people buying it and people feeling like they have to have read the latest. Well, that doesn't exist anymore.
You mean you haven't been celebrated that way?
I don't look at myself, but even writers who, are more well known, I think it's a problem across the board. And society's changing. The technology's changing, people are changing. And yeah, I think that we need to face that, and everybody will decide, how much they're going to read and how much they're going to write. I think it's still important. And I think that the recognition of that importance, will come back, or will always be with us. People will always understand how important it is to read, work that is not AI and not some, pastiche of what people found on the internet, but actually coming out of a thinking person. And I think there'll always be a need for that, but maybe not amongst the general public.
One more question. Your writing process, apart from the research and the reading, which is an inevitable part of it, how do you best work? Are you a morning person, a late night person? Do you work for an hour? Or do you have a quota of words per day? What kind of advice for writers would you be giving in terms of process?
Well, what helps me is like when I sit down to write, I sort of know the scene that I'm going to be writing, and I sort of have it in my head, and then I just sit down and write it. So it involves a lot of thinking before I even sit down. That's my way. I know there are writers who like to sit down and look at the screen and let it come. That's not me. I even like to work with a kind of very loose outline, so I know what I'm doing and where I'm going. And I'm in a constant dialogue with myself, just in terms of, okay, what should come next? And should this happen or this happen? What would work? What direction should I take this? It's a very dynamic process, but when I sit down, I like to know where I'm going.
You have a quota of words, or you want to achieve you want to finish that scene that day, or it doesn't matter, or
Very loosely,
Uh-huh.
no. Um, I don't know. I do like to think of it in terms of a scene. So if it's going well, it could even be, say, up to 2,000 words. But if it's not going well, so I can be happy that day with 100 or 200 and feel like, maybe that's not a lot of words, but at least I sort of figured out where I'm going with this. And tomorrow I'll sit down, or whatever, next time I
not
sit down, I'll know
not
what
a
it.
lot of words, but good words.
Yeah, or, it's a mental process. The words are at the end for me.
Wanted to thank you so much for such an interesting dialogue today. It was very good to meet Janice and hear Michael and hear your other thoughts about Israel and current events happening. I just want to let everybody know that our next session will be on Sunday, November 26th at 7 p.m. Everybody will get a flyer to register. We're going to be talking with Montreal author Ariella Friedman on her book, Arabic for Beginners, moderated by our very own Panina Pinchevsky, who's on our book club committee. So on behalf of CFHU, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. And Janice, have a great evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks so much.
Janice.
Thank you for
Thank
hosting
you,
me.
Esther.
Bye, everybody.